So I'm going to get right on with it, and you know, this is great because I've always wanted to introduce somebody that needs no introduction. I really don't know what I'm doing here, but Ted Barris, of course, is a writer, a journalist, a broadcaster, a professor. I don't know what all he's done, but I do know he's written 18 nonfiction books. He's working on another one. He was working on one even in the library, so it'll be coming out. It'll be coming out this fall, right? So he'll maybe tell you about that. He is legendary. Yep. Yep. Don't worry. Don't worry. He's just a little worried that I'm going to forget that 19th book that he's writing. Anyway, he's written 18 nonfiction books. And we have many of them, not all of them, but many of them in the library itself.
And if you can't find them there, just ask Connie Barr. She's got them all.
That's right. She bought in a bag of books for him to sign, and of course he was gracious enough to sign them. Oh yeah, I'd be glad to sign a book for you, not knowing how extensive her library is. She brings them all out. Anyway, so I'm going to turn it over to Ted, and we'll catch up with you in a bit.
Good. There's a chair up here. There's a chair up here for the lady, if she'd like. How many of you know the name Tommy Banks? Yeah. I hope so, yes. Legendary pianist, jazz composer, arranger, conductor, television host, senator. Tommy and I were very close. I worked on his show for a number of years when I was based in Edmonton. Can you hear me at the back okay? Yes. I worked for a number of years with Tommy writing his show in Edmonton. We got to know each other fairly well. When he became a senator, he was there when I received this pin. It's kind of a small, modest pin, but it's got a rather long name attached to it. It's called the Veterans Affairs Minister Commendation. And Tommy, when he found out that I had been awarded this, insisted that every time I spoke publicly, I should acknowledge why I wear it, where it came from. So in a couple of minutes I will do that. Jane, my wife, who's out there selling the books, and can't get in to see the presentation, but she's seen it so many times she could mimic every word. Jane and I were coming back from Berlin. We lead trips to Europe. Joe and some others in the room have been with us on the trips, and we were coming back in 2011, and I got an email from the Veterans Affairs Department. They said they wanted to speak with me, and I said, you probably have the wrong Ted Barris, I'm not a veteran. They said, no. I said, you know, you probably want to check. No, you're the guy, you're Ted Barris. Yeah, I said, what is it you need? They said, we want you to be at a ceremony later that summer where we're going to be presenting an award to you. And I said, no, you must have the wrong person, because I'm not a veteran and I haven't had that strong an association with the ministry, let alone the minister. Anyway, long story short, I went to the ceremony. They made it clear that I had to be there, and there was a whole crowd there, lots of banners, and all the minister was there, and his minions were there, and you know what that's like, Dan. All very formal, and they made the presentation, and there were a lot of veterans in the audience, and it was after I was presented this by the minister that it became clear why it was important. It had very little to do with the minister himself, or herself, if it was a female. It had very little to do with the ministry, it had everything to do with veterans. Apparently, veterans periodically decide when and how other veterans and people connected to Veterans Affairs could be recognized. Therefore, the commendation. And periodically, they acknowledge civilians as well as peers, veterans. So there was a long list, and I was on a shorter list, and a short list down to 19 people. And that's why I received this pin, and it was when I realized that I realized how humbling and such an honor it is to carry this. It's not about the ministry of the minister, it's about veterans who decided that I deserved the credit for the work that I do, some of which you'll see tonight, so I'm honored to be wearing that tonight. Yes, and before I, thank you, before I carry on, that gives me an opportunity to recognize other people in the audience whom were not recognized a moment ago. What I do depends almost entirely on the memories of veterans. I have interviewed probably 6,000 or 7,000 veterans in my life. And every one of those interviews has been a gift to me to proceed to do the writing that I do. So I want to thank you back by making sure any veteran, woman or man in this audience serving Second World War, Korean War, peacekeeping operations at home or abroad, if you wore the Canadian Forces uniform, would you, if you can, please stand so we can recognize your service to Canada. All of you. Thank you very much for being here. It's an enriching night because you have. Now I can take the jacket off. Okay. This photograph you see, colorized, was actually taken on the morning of May the 17th, 1943. If you look carefully, you can see that the shadows are very short. It's early summer. It must be about midday, maybe 11 or noon. These fellas, the 15 Canadians and one American, Joe McCarthy, if I can get this to work, right there, no relation to the senator, but there is a relation connection tonight, we'll show you later. These men have been flying all night. They have left Stanton in the early evening as the sun is setting on the 16th. They've flown all night, they've done the operation, they've come back. These are the 15 Canadians and one American, photographed later that morning. When they landed at midnight or 1 or 2 in the morning, they got the most precious meal in all of England, bacon and eggs. They maybe got a tot of rum and a coffee and went to bed. And then at 11 o'clock or noon, they were rousted out of bed, and the British airmen in the raid were photographed together, the New Zealand and Australian airmen were photographed together, and the Canadians and Joe were photographed together. Now, you can see the clarity of that photograph. It was an official RAF photography unit that took this picture. Look at well, what strikes you most about that picture? How young they are. Joe, how old was your dad there? 26?
No, 23.
23. 23-year-old man right there. The point is, this was a young operation, as all of them were. What else do you see in the picture? You can see a little bit of, well, fatigue, if nothing else. They're squinting in the sun. They've been up all night. They're used to the darkness. There's probably a little satisfaction. That's Fred Sutherland. He was the last Canadian surviving member of the Dam Busters, just died a month ago. But you see, the other thing that's in that picture, I think if you look closely, is loss. The photograph should probably be out to here. 14 of their comrades didn't come back. So there's that in that picture too. This was at a time that was key in the war. There wasn't a whole lot of good news. The end of 1942-43, of course, the greatest success that the British could point to was the pullout at Dunkirk, saved 335,000 lives. A great victory for life, but not a victory in the war. And the people at home were dealing with the Blitz not only against industrial locations in England, but in civilian centers as well. For Canadians, our crucible was Dieppe in 1942. It was designed to find out what would happen if we struck a fortified seaport in France. The result was the 9 bloodiest hours in Canadian military history. Tremendous loss of life. And we learned some lessons, which ultimately paid off, one would argue, that were, we didn't attack a fortified seaport in 1944. We found the windswept, sparsely populated beaches of Normandy to land on D-Day. But that was certainly not a victory. Nor was the attack on Pearl Harbor. The Americans were still righting themselves after that. Late 1942, early 1943, there is no good news. Okay, Dan and other historians in the audience might argue that at this point, the war was turning in North Africa. The 8th Army was beginning to push Rommel back. In fact, the Battle of the Atlantic, any Navy people here will know that that story was turning. And Stalingrad, I think the victory had occurred in February of 43. Yeah. So these were moments that they could point to, we could point to as some turn. But there was no good news, really. enter Barnes-Wallis. Barnes-Wallis was an engineer, an aviation engineer, who, well, how many of you know inventors? People who are really inventors. Many times they're standoffish, maybe a little eccentric, different, right? Maybe a little crazy, but crazy brilliant. And that's what Barnes-Wallis was. He, among other things, great aviation designer, comes up with the design of the R100 and the R101. This is the R100 passing by what was then the tallest building in the British Empire, the Royal York Hotel in Toronto. Look at the people lined up here to watch. He designed the R100. And of course, this was in a period in 1930 when the romance of the races across the North Atlantic among the great dirigibles of Germany and Britain and America for supremacy. This is why that was so important. He designed it. Now, in 1936, he's among those who assist in the design of the hardest working bomber early in the war, the Wellington. He's with Vickers Armstrong. And he designs, among other things, in the Wellington, this really intricate fuselage. What does it remind you of? The sort of lattice work. It could almost be a rosed lattice. It's so tightly lathed together. It's actually geodesic. It's a geodesic design. How many of you remember Buckminster Fuller's geodesic design at Expo? The American Pavilion, same design. He stole it from Wallace. And it's not designed to hold roses. It's designed that way so it could deliver heavier bomb loads to target. And the intricacy of that close lathe work, the geodesic design, would mean that the aircraft could maintain its integrity longer so that if the aircraft was in peril, a crew had a better chance of escaping. He's thinking about the practicality as well as the beauty and the efficiency of weaponry such as the Wellington. In 1937, Barnes-Wallis becomes a member of a committee in Britain looking forward to a new war. In 1937, it was clear war was looming. Not only was it clear that war was looming, they began to consider what might be the targets in Nazi Germany in a future war, including the Ruhr River dams. Why? Well, here was the weaponry of Nazi Germany. How did it become the weaponry? Because these things were made of steel. Steel was produced by smelters and factories in the Ruhr River Valley. Why were they in the Ruhr River Valley? Because the Ruhr River dams supplied the hydroelectricity to power that industry. Barnes-Wallis and this committee begin to consider what would happen if they targeted not the weapons, but the hydroelectric dams that powered the industry that created the weapons. In other words, he's looking at the source, not the result. Okay? Here's a clip from the movie. How many of you saw the movie in 1955, Dam Busters? I have a bunch of clips for you tonight. This one is when Michael Redgrave, who plays the role of Barnes-Wallis, is thinking out loud to a friend about the nature of the problem of the dams and the potential solution.
All of this great arsenal of war factories in the Ruhr depends for its water on three enormous dams. The Möhne, the Eder, and the Sorpe. They control the level of the canals and supply the hydroelectric power as well. When those are full, they hold 400 million tons of water. Just think of the chaos if we could break those walls down. Now, this is what I wanted to do. Drop a 10-ton bomb from 40,000 feet that would seal itself in the roots of the wall. Well, the shock waves would be tremendous. A real earthquake.
A 10-ton bomb that didn't exist, from an aircraft flying at 40,000 feet that didn't exist, with the accuracy to drop the bomb within feet of the dam wall, which didn't exist. He's dreaming in Technicolor. But did you notice what he said at the very end of his sentence? He said it would create an earthquake. In that thought is actually the key to the design he ultimately comes up with. In other words, his idea is not to blow the dam apart, but to shake it down. Big difference. Use nature around the dam to bring it down. Now here are the dams in question. Obviously they're not side by side. I simply have the images that way for you to see them. They were at different points in the river. But look at the magnitude of the water power that sits behind those reservoirs. Up here and here. Just as he was saying, massive. Now, the Nazis were so cocksure that nobody was going to touch their dams that they were not that highly defended. All they defended them with was against the potential of a sea or water-borne attack. They took booms and laid them across the reservoirs, floated them there and here, and beneath the booms they hung big torpedo nets. Torpedoes being the only thing that might penetrate to get to the dams. So torpedo nets were basically the only way they had defended it. Now, in the towers, they had some gunwork, batteries, but it was generally lightly armed. In fact, just weeks before the raid, again, they were so certain their dams were safe, they actually removed some of the guns and took them to some of the cities in the Ruhr Valley because Bomber Command was attacking the cities in a relentless fashion in the early part of March. So they're certain, the Nazis are, these dams are safe, just by the booms alone. Okay, how many of you have been to Waterloo Bridge in London? We all have. It's a tourist trap, right? You go there, and what's fascinating about it is its history, and it plays into our story. In the 1930s, the Waterloo Bridge was strengthened and widened. Now, let me preface anything further that I say by saying that I am not an engineer. I know nothing about engineering. But what becomes clear from an incident at the bridge is that the engineering reveals a secret of concrete. They're driving, in order to widen and strengthen the Waterloo Bridge, big concrete poles, pylons, into the river mud to the riverbed. Again, I know nothing about engineering. When they drove these concrete poles, pylons, with a pile driver, when the concrete pile, hit the riverbed rock, 1/500th of a second later, the vibration coming back up the concrete pole shattered it. What Barnes-Wallis discovered on the analysis of that problem was that concrete can take compression, but it cannot take tension, the rebounding vibration in the concrete. It shattered it. And in that moment, a kind of a eureka moment, Wallace recognizes that maybe the concrete in the big gravity dams of the Mona and the Eder are potentially vulnerable if you create tension in the concrete, i.e. by virtue of an earthquake. Not blasting it, shaking it, creating the tension and letting the water pressure behind the dam wall and the earth beneath it do the damage. Okay? Interesting physics. Now, I mentioned the torpedo nets. He has to get the bomb across the water to the dam. How many of you have gone to the lake on a summer morning or evening and it's as calm as glass? What do? You pick up a stone, and are you right-handed? Yeah. I'll bet you think when you throw that stone, when it goes that far, it's the power of your throw that makes it go that far, right? Wrong. It's the spinning of the stone that gets it the distance. I know nothing about engineering, I know nothing about cricket. But Barnes-Wallis had a cricketer friend who said if you put backspin on a ball and it hits a surface, hard or water, it propels the ball forward. That's the physics of it. And Wallace recognizes that if he could get the spin on a bomb, on a spherical bomb, to go across the water, it would propel the bomb forward without huge bounces. And I'll show you this in film in a little bit. So the point is he can get the bomb to propel itself towards the dam. So his first design is a spherical one, like the one on the left. This is a 10,000-pound bomb that would spin. He determines through trial and error that the bomb has to be spinning in the belly of the bomber at 500 revolutions per minute backwards. That's quite a challenge. But the additional challenge is he goes to the people at Vickers, Armstrong, and says, how long would it take you to build me a prototype of the spherical bomb that I've designed? Remember, this is 1942. They said, oh, about 2 years. That wasn't good enough. Time didn't allow. So he uses a much more conventional drum design, like a 40-gallon drum, only that thing weighs 10,000 pounds, 6,500 pounds of steel, and 3,500 pounds of Torpex, TNT. So that's the design that's going to be spinning in the belly of ultimately the Lancaster. Because now the Lancasters are coming off the line, and they modify the 4-engine Lancaster because it can carry 10,000 pounds worth of bomb, but in addition to that, they have to find a way for that carrying to occur. You all know better than I the intricacies of an inside of a Lancaster, and also its profile. Right up here would normally be a mid-upper gun turret. They took it out. And then inside the Lancaster, they created where the base of the mid-upper gun turret was big steel calipers, which would cradle the 10,000 pound bomb. Okay, so these come out of the body, down into the belly. Now, they took off, am I getting too technical? They took off the bomb bay doors. Okay, they're gone. But they did not remove the motor, which would open and close the bomb bay doors. It's still there, and they turn it, and they create a chain kind of effect, which will allow it in the calipers to rotate backwards 500 revolutions per minute in the belly of the Lancaster. Ken Brown, one of the dam buster pilots from Moose Jaw, said when the 10,000 pound bomb was spinning in the belly of the 12-ton Lancaster, it was like driving over cobblestones, like this. Okay? But this is the idea to deliver the bomb. Every Lancaster is going to carry one bomb, because they can only carry the one 10,000 pound bomb. This is how it'll get there. Now, here are the physics of it. Again, I'm not an engineer or anything. This is design that I managed to find in the documents. So here are the elements that will deliver the bomb to do the damage, to shake the dam down. The Lancaster, he determines, has to be traveling at 235 miles an hour. Not peak speed, but close, I think. Any of the specialists on that sort of thing in the audience can correct me. The point is, it's got to be going at that speed in order to deliver the bomb with enough forward momentum to get to the dam with the spin. So the bomb would drop from the belly, from the calipers, spinning backwards at 500 revolutions, and bounce over top of the torpedo nets to get to the wall. But the bomb has to be dropped at exactly, he determines after trial and error, 60 feet above the surface of the water. All the altimeters in Lancasters during the war, in fact everything, were not particularly true when it came to flying over water. Good over land, but altimeters didn't work well over water. So they came up with the cross light system, all the slams. One just in the nose and the other behind the bomb bay, and the angles they determined ultimately, again through trial and error, when the two beams of light came down to the water, when the aircraft was 60 feet off the water, given the angle of the lights, the dots of the two lights would come together, and the navigator looking at the two lights and guiding the pilot to that altitude could determine for the aircraft that it was 60 feet off the water. It couldn't be 80 feet, because if they dropped it at 80 feet, it would hit the water and disintegrate. Too much power. If they were below 60 feet, say 30 feet, the plume of the splash could knock the tail off the plane. It had to be 60 feet off the water at 235 miles an hour with the bomb spinning backwards. And they had to drop it within about 800 yards of the dam to bounce and come to a gentle stop here, spinning, sink, and explode like a depth charge. That was the technique. I was doing this talk back in the fall. I did this talk 90 times between September and December last fall. In the front row, on one of the early talks, there's a guy on his phone doing this. And I thought, oh God, it's one of my students. No. I asked him what he was doing. He said, I'm trying to figure out how long it would take a Lancaster to travel the distance, 800 yards, traveling at 235 miles an hour. I said, what's the answer? He said, between 5 and 8 seconds. Which means that all the things I've just described have to come together in between 5 and 8 seconds. The altitude, the spinning bomb, the speed, the attitude, and the dropping of the bomb in order to make it work. But Barnes-Wallis goes so far as to prove it with film. Here is the first film of a mosquito dropping a sized-down spherical bomb, creating or operating under the same principles that a larger bomb in a larger aircraft would achieve. It's in slow motion. Watch what happens when the spherical bomb hits the water. Watch this. Watch the way it jumps forward. Boom! Straight ahead. And again, straight ahead. Why? Because it's spinning. Now it jumps here, and again, but the point is, it's in a perfectly straight trajectory at the target. Okay? So this rather idiosyncratic, off-the-wall inventor has come up with a bouncing bomb. Now all he has to do is convince the powers to be that this will work. Arthur Harris sees this and calls it tripe. Why would I risk the lives of 7 men in a Lancaster for this kind of nonsense? So the trick is for Barnes Wallis to get to the 2 most important ears in all of England, those of Winston Churchill. And ladies and gentlemen, here's the first piece of Canadian history of the evening. He gets to Winston Churchill thanks to a Canadian. Max Aitken, Lord Beaverbrook, is at that time the Minister of Aircraft Production. Of course, he's the big newspaper magnate who goes to England, gets elected as an MP, and in 1940, because he's pals with Churchill, sort of, they were at odds on other things. The point is, Churchill makes him Minister of Aircraft Production, and because he knows Wallis, Wallis has an entree to Churchill. As an example of how they knew each other, Wallis and Beaverbrook, go back to 1940, 3 years before the bouncing bomb is invented, and a conversation in July of 1940 between Beaverbrook, Minister of Aircraft Production, and his chief designer, Barnes Wallis, at Vickers. And Beaverbrook says to him, I want you to go to the United States. He wanted to go to the US because the Americans were beginning to work on pressurized cabins inside aircraft flying at altitude. And Wallis says, I'd rather stay and work for you here, sir, because I'm working on the notion of pressurized air interiors in Wellingtons. I don't have to go to the United States. So Beaverbrook says, well, what would you do for me here? And Wallis says, I'd build you a 10-ton bomb. And he says, what would that do? And Wallis says, end the war. 1940. But you can see that they know each other. And Wallis has this entree with Beaverbrook vis-a-vis or ultimately to Churchill. I mean, there's much else that happens in the run-up to this decision to give this operation the green light. And I explain it all in the book. But essentially, for us as Canadians, it's important, I bet you didn't teach you that in history class, that it was Beaverbrook who gave essentially enough of a crack in the door for Wallis to get in. Okay, so now we've got all the elements. We've got the physics of the bomb, the aircraft to get it there, the technique, the film. Now what we need is the software to deliver it, the crews. Here's another scene from the movie. This features Richard Todd as Guy Gibson, the commander of 617. And this is when he first meets with the men he's picked for the operation. There are 133 men in the room, a quarter of whom are Canadians. At this moment, about March the 29th, 1943, even Gibson does not know what the target is. And this is what he says.
Now, I understand that the job, whatever it is, has got to be done at low level. So the first thing is to practice low flying day and night until we can do it with our eyes shut.
You can see that it's shot in black and white. When all of the aircraft were modified just like the originals, with the calipers and so on, there were 4 of them, and the guys flying in the movie are RAF Cold War pilots. They're used to flying jets. What was it, Roger, they were flying? Canberras. But now they're flying the Lancasters in the movie, and the first rushes of the film shooting come back to the director, Michael Anderson, and Anderson says, you know guys, flying 60 feet off the water isn't dramatic enough. I want you to fly lower. And the pilot said, bring it on. They loved it. They went down to 40 feet off the deck, just for the movie director. But we'll get back to the movie. Notice it's in black and white. We'll come back to that later. Do you want to take a break here, Doug? No. I got a resounding no.
All right, carry on.
Carry on? Okay. All right. So there are a lot of pilots in this room. When I talk about low flying from a 2019 perspective, when you look at that notion of flying low, we equate that probably in many cases with hot dogging, right? It's about showing up. Well, I'm not a pilot, but I've flown low enough in an aircraft often enough to know that when you're flying at low altitude, it's exhilarating, right? You sense the speed better than anywhere else if you're just off the deck, right? But this wasn't about hot dogging, it was about preparing for an operation. They had to fly from England to Germany and back at such low altitude as not to be spotted by the Freya, the German radar. Now, anybody hear me on CBC this morning? Yeah. A few people? Oh, good. I must tell CBC that you were all listening. Thank you. I mentioned to the people listening on air, if they looked at a tree outside their window that was about 60 feet tall, you had a big, maybe a big pine, spruce, or something about 60 feet, maybe the tallest part of this building would be 30 feet off the ground. If you double it, imagine the Lancasters flying all the way, I think I've got it, I haven't got it in the next slide, it's coming, all the way from Scampton to the Ruhr and back. Why? Because the Freya radar that the Germans had was great above 100 feet, but not below. The idea was to keep the Lancasters below 100 feet, and so they were to train for the next 6 weeks, doing nothing but flying at low altitude. Do you know how many hours they accumulated in 6 weeks, low altitude, often at night? 2,000 hours they accumulated, the 19 Lancasters that were involved in this. So the process was this. Gibson sends out one crew to fly all over England and to take photographs of all open spaces over water that they could fly over, open spaces about along straightaways where the ground was flat and low, so that the Lancasters could do cross-country training trips to get used to the idea of flying low, okay? So this aircraft goes out, takes the pictures, comes back, and all these Lancasters begin to take off around the end of March, flying night and day below 100 feet. If you look at Ken Brown's log from Moose Jaw, on the 31st of March, he records Lancaster, South crew, cross-country, bombing, 200 feet. He was told right from the get-go, you're going to fly at 100 feet. And in order to keep the pilots honest, Gibson sent out Royal Observer Corps observers all around the route that they would be taking. Why? To make sure the pilots stayed below 100 feet. So Ken Brown, on his first run, on the 31st, goes out. And one of those areas on the cross-country, he's flying over open land, and suddenly, dead ahead of him, is an aerodrome hangar under construction. There are guys all over it, and he's coming right at it. And they see him. And they start jumping off the building. They think he's going to plow right into the hangar. At the last second, Brown climbs above, goes up to 200 feet to clear the hangar, and flies on. The Royal Observer guy spots him, and he's on the carpet the next day. And here's what happens to poor Ken Brown.
So at briefing he said, Brown, what are you doing going over top of the hangar? And I said, well, I thought it was a good idea. And he said, 200 feet? Hardly.
Too high.
You'll do that one again. And it wasn't a bad cross country anyhow. So I did it the next day. When I came to the hangar, same thing. All these men working on top of the hangar, this side of it and so forth. So I put it down on grass level and then came up over top of the hangar. There was people sliding off it, running in that direction. So next day at briefing, he looked in my direction again and said, Brown, I said low, but not that low.
But again, the point is, this was partly to prove to himself that he could do it. It's partly to show his 7-man crew, including himself, what it felt like to do it constantly, so that they could do it for 6 hours, there and back, training his crew for the 2,000 hours training, and it was to prove to Gibson he could do it. So it's not hot dogging, it's rehearsal. So imagine we've got to go from Scampton, in the middle of Lincolnshire, in 3 waves. The first wave came south across the North Sea, all below 100 feet. Think of that 60-foot tree, okay? Through the Scheldt estuary to the Ruhr, and then the others went across the northern route, through the Frisians, and down the Zuider Zee to the Ruhr. Brown said when they passed the Frisian islands, they were dodging the islands, they were so low. Some of the German batteries that spotted them were shooting down at them, not up. That's how low they were flying. For 3 hours in and 3 hours back. This was the attitude coming to the Mona. Again, I remind you of some of those components I talked about. Speed, attitude, altitude. They would do a right angle, run at Lake Dam. This might be 1,000 yards here. Well, it's about a mile from there, once they hopped over this spit and did the run to the dam. Okay? What did I say it took to cover that distance? Between 5 and 8 seconds. Now, let's figure out what's going on inside the aircraft when that's happening. This is a painting by Mark Postlethwaite, who is also a dam buster historian from England. He's depicting one of the aircraft in the final attack of the Mona. The Mona's in the distance. You can see one of the towers. Okay? So, the pilot has flown 3 hours or thereabouts to get the aircraft. The pilot, of course, is sitting in the left-hand side of the cockpit up here. He's gotten us there. And now all the other crewmen come into play. Well, to a certain extent, the flight engineer's been helping us get there too, because he's sitting on the right side of the cockpit, and he's monitoring the Merlins. He's got his hands on the throttles, giving him the speed, 235. He's calling out in the intercom to the pilot sitting next to him, 227, 230, 235. To get to that speed, he's calling that out with his hands on the same way you've got your foot on an accelerator in a car. You press down to give it the speed and back off to reduce. He's doing that with the throttles, more or less. Okay? Behind them is the navigator. He's looking at a perspex, a bubble, which allows him to see down. Why? To spot the dots of the two Aldous lamps coming together. You can see in the distance, this aircraft is too high because the crisscross is above the water. This is exactly, and now the navigator's calling on the intercom also to the pilot. Up, up, steady, steady, because he's looking at the dots, and he can see the dots come together, and when they converge, steady, steady, he's calling the pilot to do this, okay? Behind them is the wireless radio operator. He's the guy controlling the spinning bomb. He sets it in motion. It hasn't been spinning all the way. He just begins it here, and it's on the run into the dam in that 1,000 yards. So now it starts to spin. The navigator's calling the altitude. Flight engineer the speed. The pilot's consuming all this, getting a sense of how things are coming together. And one other guy is really important in the scenario, the bomb aimer. He's lying in the nose of the Lang, straight at the perspex, looking out, lining up the dam with a bomb sight. There is an exact replica of the bomb sight they used. Whoops. In the dark. The principle is this. They figured this out through a lot of trial and error and using all that engineering that I know nothing about. Essentially what they determined, based on the angle of the pieces of wood, if the bomb aimer, lying on his belly, looking out the perspex, brought the peephole up to his eye, he'd look out past the pins, and the towers on the dam, there's one on each side. When they were in the distance, they were fairly close together. The closer the dam got, or the aircraft got to the dam, the towers began to separate. When he was able to line up the pins of the bomb sight with the towers of the dam, the physics and geometry were that the aircraft was within 800 yards of the dam, and he could press the plunger and release the bomb. Okay? Oh yes, we have two gunners, one in the nose and one in the tail, because the Germans are shooting at them too. And how long did we have to get this all together? 5 to 8 seconds. If this isn't the most incredible piece of military teamwork flying you've ever heard of, I don't know what is. And remember, that bomber is rocking and rolling like it's going over cobblestones as he's trying to line up those pins. Because it's all happening. And if it didn't work, it was a dummy run. They had to go around and do it again. Because they only had one bomb and they had to get it right. Dave Roger, who was a rear gunner in Joe McCarthy's aircraft, said of that operation, we were 7 men against the Reich. Think about that. They are 3 hours from home, a long way from safety. None of them is wearing a parachute because you're 100 feet off the deck. Why bother? You don't have time to jump and have it deploy. They were out there alone on a moon-filled or moonlit dark night in Germany, far from home. They were 7 men against the Reich. I was going to call the book that, but then Dam Busters is so much more well-known. So anyway, imagine all of that having to come together in that short time span and that space. Let's talk about a few of the crews. Remember I told you about the aircraft that went out and took photography so that they could plan out the cross-country route? AJB for Baker did this. And there were some Canadians on this aircraft. I want to tell you a little bit about it. Al Garshowitz, the wireless air gunner, was the photographer. He did all the shooting of the land and the water that they were going to be flying over to take back to Gibson. But he was such a shutterbug, he loved photography. While he was in the air, he took a shot of his pilot, Bill Astle. And he had somebody take a shot of him at his position. And he took a shot of Floyd Wilde, their navigator from Scotch Village, Nova Scotia, and Frank Garbus from Hamilton. Oh, by the way, Al and Frank were both from Hamilton. They had been friendly rivals on a rugby team, in a rugby league in Hamilton in the 1930s. There they are together. They joined up the Air Force together, they became WAGs together, ended up on the same squadron, the same aircraft, the same op. The 2 guys from Hamilton. So Garshowitz goes up and he has pictures taken of everybody. Oh yes, he took some pictures of some of the lakes that they were in and around. All of which was illegal. This is a top secret operation. None of this stuff is supposed to get, okay, take pictures of the land and the water, that's it. But he took pictures of the crewmen and of the Lancasters, and somehow they got past the censors. He tucked them in an envelope and sent them home to his family. They are the only photographs that exist today of the training period between March the 29th and the operation on May the 16th, 1943. They are the only evidence of the training. All done illegally. If Gibson knew he'd taken these photographs, Garshowitz would have been up on charges, thrown out of the Air Force, and of course the photography burned. But he sent them home. Garshowitz was also an incessant writer. He wrote letters to his mom and his dad and his uncle and his brother, and I got a hold of all of that literature of his explanation. I mean, obviously that was censored. He had to be careful what he's talking about. But all those letters. So he was a real writer and photographer and a wireless radio operator. Now, I've hesitated or haven't explained this perhaps clearly enough. From the time they're all signed up to do this operation in late March until May the 16th, they do not know what the target is. They're training over land, over water, and some of them begin to think, because of the repetition of going over the Derwent Dam in northwest England, they must be training for an attack on the battleship Tirpitz, which is the German battleship Tirpitz, which is tucked up a fjord in Norway. They figure that's their target. They're thinking this, right? On the 16th of May is when they learned, the day they actually left. The majority of the air crews did not know until that very day that their targets were the Roar River dams. They were trained for everything, low level, great distance, dropping the bomb, and they had dropped it on targets, inert bombs, to practice, but they didn't know what the target was till the 16th. Okay? So Garshowitz, on the day of the operation, a bit of a poet, the upkeep, that's the code name for the bomb, is tucked into the belly of a Lancaster, only one bomb per Lancaster, and he takes a piece of chalk, and borrowing from Churchill, he writes on the bomb, "Never has so much been expected of so few." He was afraid. They all were. Who wouldn't be? AJB for Baker didn't get it. They were shot down on the way and lost. All men lost. And their stories would have evaporated with them were it not for the fact that those wonderful letters, those flight logs, and all those illegal pictures came home to Garshowitz's family, and suddenly they come to life in the literature and the correspondence, some of the illegal diaries they kept. When you find them, and I went to the families to help me dig that story out, those stories out, to have these guys come to life. What a difference when you do the digging. That's what this museum does every day. Ask Doug. That's what he does. Thanks to him, people such as myself get the chance to do this. Okay, another of the aircraft, Q for Queen. Its pilot is Joe McCarthy, the one American among the Canadians. There he is there. And we are very fortunate today to have Joe's son, Joe Jr., with us tonight. Joe? What a lot of people don't know is, Joe had an interesting route to this particular operation. Born in the United States, he actually grew up in New York City, made a bit of a living as a lifeguard on Coney Island, and the money that he earned in the Coney Island lifeguard work, he took to Roosevelt Field on Long Island, and he trained to get his private pilot's license. By 1938-39, just as the war begins, he presents himself to the U.S. Army Air Force. Well, the Americans aren't in the war in 1939, they're isolationists. Doesn't this sound familiar? Anyway, they turn him down, but he knows that there is a country and an Air Force screaming for men who can fly and navigate and do all the other aircrew trades that are required. So a wonderful network, and I go into this in the book to some extent. There's a network that's developed to smuggle qualified aircrew from the United States to Canada. Why? Because the Americans are governed by the Neutrality Act. No one can be seen to be aiding and abetting a combatant party. So Joe, through this wonderful network called the Clayton Knight Committee, makes his way to Ottawa, to Toronto, gets his training, does really, really well, and he gets his wings near December 1941, which of course is the time of the Pearl Harbor raid, and he is one of 6,000 Americans either in the Air Force or in the British Commonwealth Air Training Plan, training other aircrew in Canada. And they're all told, the Americans, you can go back to America, we haven't taken away your citizenship, you can go back and join the U.S. Army Air Force to defend your country, or you can stay in the RCAF. Joe stays in the RCAF, does a tour with his Canadian crew, including Bill Radcliffe from New Westminster, who's the flight engineer, the guy with his hands on the throttles of the Merlins. Dave Roger, the rear gunner I just mentioned, from Sault Ste. Marie, he was with Algoma Steel. And their navigator, Don McLean, from Toronto, who was a teacher and a hockey player. In fact, he discovered, as a new teacher, looking for work, that if he told the boards of the education boards if he was a good hockey player, he was more likely to get work at the school board than because he was a good teacher. So he was a good hockey player, not a teacher. But he was also a pretty good navigator. Okay, so now, Joe is among the pilots who learns early, within 24 hours of the raid, what's going to happen. And their target is slightly different from the gravity dams that I've described to you earlier with the big concrete holding all the blocks together. They're going to attack the Sorpa Dam, which is, if you can imagine that fluorescent light, is a wall. And on either side is earth. It was an earthen dam, the Sorpa, and literally in the hours before they left, they had to recalibrate what they were going to do in their attack. They weren't going to go 90 degrees at the dam. They were not going to spin the bomb. They were going to drop it in parallel along the dam. Like that. In other words, not come at it from here, but come over this ridge across the top of the church, swoop down, very high altitude, down into the valley, line up the dam, drop it just to the right of the dam, and then get the hell out of there, up before you ran into the side of the hill on the other side of the reservoir. And all of this, the crew determines on the day of the op, right, Joe? All this was determined on their final day. So, they're all bombed up, ready to go. It's the evening of the 16th. They're all ready to go in Q for Queenie. Joe looks out and sees hydraulic fluid pouring from one of the engines of the Lang. He's not going anywhere. But he knows there's one spare Lancaster for just such an eventuality. And he swears, let's get that other aircraft, T for Tommy, before some bastard does. We want to go. We want to be on it. So they now start throwing all their gear out of Q for Queenie. books, gear, parachutes. One of them deploys. There's silk flying around. It's like the Keystone Cops as they run to Tea for Tommy. They load up Tea for Tommy, and they leave 30 minutes late, but they're away, and away they go. Okay? Now, one of the things that the navigators had to deal with, all of them, was something that we've dealt with as car drivers for years before GPS, and that is big, bulky paper maps, right? Like that one. So I'm driving along, and I'm thinking, now what exit do I get off to go to the airport in Victoria? And I pull out the map. Oh, it's upside down. I turn it over. Somebody opens the window, and the paper's flying around the inside. Very inefficient. Not particularly practical, even and particularly in the air. So the navigators come up with a really neat idea. They realize they're going to be flying so low that the area of ground is fairly narrow. They take the maps and they trim off the excess and put the remaining map in the center of their path, their corridor, on rollers. So the navigator can sit at his nav table and roll the rollers and scroll the map in front of him without dealing with the paper all over the inside of his navigating position, right? McLean looks at this and says to himself, yes, interesting idea, but what if you're off course? And his decision to stick with the big paper map helps save the men on his crew that night. Because they leave Sorpe and they go back across Germany past the Mona, which has been broken by the other crews earlier in the night. They see it spewing water, and Joe McCarthy, turns to Don for coordinates for home, which he starts to give him. And suddenly Joe is on the blower to Don. They're heading right into a whole pile of lights. They're not supposed to be going over a city. So Joe goes into a circuit, 180 degrees, at 100 feet, while Don figures out why his calculations are off. He suddenly realizes, here was the problem. Every aircraft, as you all know, has steel in it which has an impact on the compass. But not every aircraft has the same impact on the compass as every other. What did they do? They went from Q for Queenie to T for Tommy. So all of his coordinates, or all of his calculations are off. Something like, what was it, 6 degrees? Anyway, the point is, instead of getting him, the crew, across the darkened part of Germany, his calculations have them flying straight into the city of Hamm, bristling with guns and sure death. Now they're in a circuit while Don's doing the recalculations after he realizes this, and of course he's deciding to use, the map, which gives him a wider view to get the hell out of there, right? While he's doing that, they're in the circuit and they feel a thud. Bang! They're hit on the right side. Joe calls to the other 6 members on the intercom. Everybody's okay, okay, okay. Don gives them the coordinates. They continue on their way, and they're flying home, and they're approaching Scampton. They've made it all the way back, under 100 feet, back to Scampton. They're in their final approach. Joe drops the landing gear. There's no right landing gear. It's gone. The shell came through the landing gear, blew up the wheel, came through the wing, barely missing the fuel tank, and crashed into the Astrodome, sending hot shrapnel down on poor Don McLean. It's not enough that he's just dealing with the stress of having to do recalculations and getting them home. Now there's hot shrapnel pouring down on him as a result of the shell. Anyway, so now they approach, and you guys know better than I how you land an aircraft with one wheel. You trim it to the wheel you got, and you bring it roughly to a stall over the grass. Just before it stalls, you're over the grass, it drops on the ground on that wheel. You allow the wing to come down gently, and you do a ground loop, right? In which they do one big wide ground loop, comes to a stop, and everybody is safe. Unbelievable flying, okay? Here are the final entries in Don McLeod's navigational table that night. He indicates that they hit the target, the Sorpa, at 12:30. They landed at 1:37. He signs off, Don McLean, and he writes the date, the 17th of May, 1943. If that's not the shakiest date entry you've ever seen in your life. His 2 sons, Jim and Bill, said to me when I interviewed them, their dad sat at a navigation table, you can verify this, Joe, that Don always said when he left on every op, I will not make it through this day. I will not come home. And he did it through the tours that were required to bring his crews home. Is that an appropriate spot to have a short break? I think maybe that. Anyway, so these guys get home. These guys did not. This is M for Mother. John Hopgood, one of Gibson's closest friends, great pilot. They had been hit on the way over in Holland. They're hit so badly that the front gunner was killed, and shell hits here and it wounds John Hopgood. So much so that flight engineer Charlie Brennan from Calgary is not only handling the Merlins, he's bandaging up Hopgood so they can carry on. Behind them is navigator Ken Earnshaw. Earnshaw is from Ohatan, Alberta. They're flying together, and they do their final run against the dam. And they're hit again as the bomb is dropped. And this aircraft is doomed. Now, when the 10,000-pound bomb drops, the natural reaction of the Lank is to ascend. But it keeps going, because Hopgood figures the only way this crew's got a chance of getting the hell out of here is to climb as fast as he possibly can. And what did I tell you about chutes? They're not wearing them. So now this is the only opportunity for those who can get out to suit up. But Brennan isn't leaving Hopgood, nor is Earnshaw. In the nose of this aircraft is one man who has a chance. John Fraser, from Nanaimo. John Fraser is on his belly. There's that shot on the left-hand side is a stock shot from the movie showing the bomb site. John Fraser's on his belly. Look, obviously this is a day shot, but he's looking through that perspex at the dam. He has released the bomb, and he feels the aircraft begin to climb, and he knows from listening on the intercom this is trouble. He has only one opportunity, and that is to punch out that exit door, open up into the darkness of the night, and he sees the ground falling away from him. He shoots into his parachute. He's not going to jump because there's not enough space. So he deploys the chute in the bomb aimer's position with the air circulating in it. It sucks him out. He shoots past the bottom of the aircraft. Look what he says. I rolled out and the tail wheel whizzed by my ear. 3 seconds later, he lands on the ground perfectly safe, is captured, goes to Stalag Luft 3, the Great Escape Camp, and gets home. Tonight we are honored to have a dam buster's daughter with us. John Fraser's daughter, Cher, is here, and she's married to Joe McCarthy. And for those of you who really want a story, wait until Cher finishes her book on her dad. You'll get the whole story on John's life, because that's in the works. She's promised Doug she's going to come back when the book is out to talk to you all about that story. But we're not finished with Cher. I'll come back to her in a minute. Look at this map. This is a map of all the Canadians who served in the Dam Busters raid. It is a pan-Canadian event. It shows you how strong the Canadian content was in this operation. In fact, there's 31 names. Hugh Monroe was a radar technician, also Canadian from Montreal, served at 617 and worked with the crews on radar. I include his name there. So what's the elephant in the room here?
Any Newfoundlanders?
Unfortunately not. But they were still flying in the RAF, same as many Canadians.
Newfoundland existed even if it wasn't in Canada.
Hell hath no fury like a Newfoundlander storm. Okay. The elephant in the room here, folks, and I don't think I have to wax eloquent about this too long. How did these guys get so, excuse me, shit hot good? Why were they such good airmen? Because the training they went through to get there made them that way. And anybody who's done any reading knows that Canada's largest wartime investment largest investment in the Second World War was training aircrew in the British Commonwealth Air Training Plan. And if you wonder just how much of an influence the BCATP had on this raid, look at this. Of the 133 airmen on the raid, in 19 Lancasters, I researched every one. 56 of them were trained in Canada, even if they weren't Canadians. Because the plan trained Commonwealth aircrew from Australia, New Zealand, Rhodesia, South Africa, Britain, Canada, the United States, Czechoslovakia, the Free French. They were all here in Canada learning. Do you know how many men we trained in the BCATP? 225,000 men. On any given day, between 1939 and 45, there could be as many as 10,000 training aircraft, like the ones in this museum, Harvard's and others, in the air training aircrew. 231 schools. I wrote a book entirely about these men and women, called Behind the Glory, because they got no glory. We've talked about that sort of one-on-one. But the point is, this is the incredible background to this story that no one talks about. My book, the Dam Busters book, is dedicated to the men and women of the BCATP. That's why it's such an important story. Here's what they did. Some of it was terrific, some of it wasn't. They breached the Mona, that's the Mona leaking there. It was like that for 48 hours, gushing water for 100 miles, wiping out factories, airfields, marshalling yards, crops, and killing 1,400 people, most of whom were innocent. The forced laborers in the factories from the Soviet Union and Holland and Belgium and POWs, all killed in the flood that wiped them out. But one of the elements that not too many historians look at, and it's key in this story too, is its long-range impact. This did not deliver a death blow to the Ruhr River industry. Not even a chance. What it did is it knocked out two key hydroelectric dams. It essentially eliminated the power that they would have delivered for a year. Why? Because even though the Germans went ahead and rebuilt the dams, the water wouldn't return to the reservoirs until the following spring. But the Nazis were so pissed off that the RAF and Bomber Command would have the temerity to attack their dams, they decided that to pay them back with the propaganda that they felt was important, they were going to build this dam, rebuild this dam faster than you could imagine. They did it in 79 days. But here's what they did to do it. They brought forced labor from all over Europe, the same as they had to the valleys, to the industrial plants. And they happened to bring a lot of those workers from one of Hitler's favorite construction sites, the Atlantic Wall, which meant that the wall construction slowed down, diminished, in some cases stopped, so that the 7,000 people required to come and rebuild the dam for the egos of the Nazis meant that the wall wasn't under construction as quickly as it should be, and one could argue that the dams raid gave the invasion a leg up 2 years later. Interesting, eh? I'm not the first one to say that. There are others who offer that particular point of view. Anyway, now we got some good news. The newspapers are crowing about what this has achieved. Again, not a death blow, not a strategic or tactical victory. When you consider the numbers of the 19 Lancasters that went out, only 11 came back. 8 crews lost. So this was a dear operation, very costly. But one of the key moments in the book, and it hasn't really hit me until I've reflected on it as often as I do, within days of the raid, of those pictures I showed you at the very beginning of the aircrew all lined up, guess who came to Scampton? None other than King George and Queen Elizabeth. And it wasn't one of those formal, standoffish, royalty over there and citizenry over here and, you know, very, very formal distance between them. They mingled with the crews on the station. And you know what they said in so many words? And this comes through in Joe's reflections, Joe's dad's reflections of that moment. They said, "Thank you. You have given us hope." When they needed it most, the Allies had this operation to turn to. 2 days later, Winston Churchill's in Congress in Washington. He can not only talk about the 8th Army turning around the tide in North Africa and Stalingrad and the Battle of the Atlantic. He can talk about the blow that they've delivered to the Roe River Valley and say to the Americans, by the way, time to ante up. The Commonwealth's been shouldering the war far too long, and it works dramatically in making the Americans recognize what the Allies have been up to. Let's talk about the movie for a few minutes. Very expensive. Look at the price tag. £200,000. One of the reasons it cost that, and I go into long detail as to how they made the movie. It's fascinating. They had huge sound stages where they built the models and the replicas and so on. I'll show you some more of that in a few minutes. But one of the most expensive costs in the film was the use of the 4 Lancasters. Not just in rental. Here's how the British Film Company paid for the use of the 4 Lancs, which were modified back to the configuration of the Dambusters, Lancasters. Every time one of the Lancasters fired up an engine, it cost the film company £100 per minute. times four, if there were 4 in the air. That's a lot of money. Once you're in the air, shooting air to air and ground to air and air to ground stuff. Very expensive. That was one of the costs that the film company paid to the RAF for the Lancaster. All right, but my question to you is, did they get it right? There's one young man back here who probably, when I say war films, you think digital animation to the nth degree, and it makes it so real. You probably, better than anybody in this room, you know how to handle Tour of Duty and all those interesting video games that make war so lifelike with digital animation. They didn't have this in 1954. None of that. So park that outside the door while you watch this. Did they get it right? Watch this scene in the bombing of the dam.
Hey, I'm making bombing now.
Again, notice it's black and white. This is replicating a moonlit night. Not 60 feet off the water, but 40. And the reason it was shot in black and white is so that they could cut actual film footage of the trials of the bomb drops. This is all optically done, not digital. And this bomber's going to drop a bomb, and it's going to cut to the spherical drop bomb in England, right there. And we're made to believe that that's in Germany. And now the final explosion. Star Wars. But it ain't bad. Interestingly, someone pointed this out to me after I finished the book. Interestingly, if you take the chatter of the air crews going in to bomb the dam and you line it up, you've probably done this, and you line it up with the chatter on the attack of the Death Star in Star Wars, it is exactly identical to the Star Wars and the Dam Busters. They have stolen the Dam Busters chatter and inserted it into Star Wars. It's exactly the same. You see that, Gene? It's amazing how dead on it is. All right, did they get it right? Here's another scene in which we learn how Guy Gibson comes up with the idea that the scriptwriter was a guy named R.C. Sheriff, and he is given all the research to come up with the idea of how they would spotlight the altitude above the water. So he sends Guy Gibson to the theater. He looks off to the left and sees the spotlight coming down on the dancer. And on the stage is another spotlight from the right, which is a measurable distance. And the angles can determine altitude, and he figures this is the way they can determine the altitude over the water. Total BS. Did not happen. Hollywood, in England. Essentially, they had been using the idea of the crisscross Aldous lamps since the Great War. The problem was, over rough water, the two dots were not very perceptible coming together. The water would break up the light, and they abandoned it, right? But how else are you going to get dancing girls in the movie? Works for me. Okay. Did they get it right? Here's where Guy Gibson determines who's going to go on the op.
You'll find pretty well everyone that matters in here, sir. On this board or here in these albums. Right, thank you. Now then, oh, thanks. I'd go for these two Australians if I were you. Les Knight and Mickey Martin. Martin knows pretty well all there is to know about low flying. Yes, I met him when he was collecting his DFC.
Got the Australians.
I know there's New Zealander, there's Monroe, I'd like to have him.
Got the New Zealander.
Oh, and Joe McCarthy, he's great. Oh, the American, the glorious blonde. Used to be a Coney Island beach guard. You mustn't forget the English.
Excuse me? Is there another elephant in the room here, perhaps? How about the Canadians? The 15 Canadians, the 1 American, and John Fraser, who jumped from that aircraft. Not a mention. If you look carefully in the movie, you'll see some of the actors wearing Canada patches, but none of them have speaking roles. Nor is there any mention of the 14 Canadians who didn't come back. Add to which, Guy Gibson had 2 Canadians on board his aircraft. His gunner, George Deering of Central Ontario. Harlow Tarum, great story. This is a Norwegian Canadian from Milo, Alberta. He grows up in a time in the 30s on the farm. His dad dies in a swimming accident. He's left with the responsibility to take care of the farm, helping his mother raise siblings, go all the way across to the country schoolhouse, an A student, brilliant, great athlete, graduates, goes to Calgary, enrolls in a radio program in Calgary. The war breaks out, and he signs up an automatic navigator, graduates high in his class, if not first, close to it. And normally, at the end of training in the British Commonwealth Air Training Plan, what would happen is you'd go home on embarkation leave. Before you went to England, you get one chance to go home. See your family, get on a train, go to Halifax, get on a troop ship, over to England. They flew Harlow Tarum, because he was such a good navigator, to Gander. And they put him in a Hudson on his first war op ever to navigate from Gander to Prestwood. Good pilot with him. They did it in record time. Not a mention in the movie. He led, according to Gibson, Tarum led the squadron to the dams. Not a mention in the movie. Okay. John Fraser's story doesn't end with his jumping out of that M for mother. One of the things that this museum here stands for, and others in this country, the Canadian Warplane Heritage Museum in Hamilton, the Bomber Command Museum in Nanton, is that people there care about these stories long enough to make them survive. The dams raid occurred in the middle of the war in 1943. There was a whole lot of war after 1943, and that story gets lost. Add to which, after the war, everything that could be suggested as part of this story, including artifacts, becomes very valuable. And here you wonder if, when you read the book, the raid ends about page 220. Why is there another 100 pages in the book? Where's he going? Well, the reality is the story needed saving. And who saved it? But the museums like this one, and the Warplane Heritage Museum, and the Nanton Museum, not just by preserving things, but by preserving people's stories. And when the artifacts from this raid were jeopardized by people masquerading as historians, swooping down on unsuspecting families, looking for these artifacts, allegedly to do research, and they weren't interested in research at all, but simply the theft of those things. The Dam Buster story needed to be saved. And this lady sitting right here tonight is part of that story. She went to bat for her dad because her dad's log was among those artifacts stolen by an alleged historian. She forced the British police to bring this guy to justice. Not just to have justice and to hopefully return the flight laws, but to save the story of her father and his comrades. That's the story in the latter part of the book. That's the story that Cher's working on now to bring back to you someday. That's why people are so vital in this incredible story. It's not about things, it's about saving history and the face of it. For me. Have I got that relatively right, Cher? There's a picture of her dad when she went to England. A man named Alex Bateman was found guilty of theft, and not just the theft of John Fraser's log, but also of Ken Earnshaw's photo album, and that's Ken's nephew, Jim Heather. There's Joe and Cher and Rob Tarrant's, Harlow Tarrant's nephew. Cher made sure that when that guy went to trial and what was recoverable was recovered, was returned to the family, including those stolen photographs returning to Jim Heather from Ken Earnshaw.
Almost 300 photos. The police found Ken Earnshaw's photo album in Alex Bateman's closet when they were looking for my dad's logbook.
And they wouldn't have gone there were it not for Cher. So what I'm saying is, and she will do it in this upcoming book, you now have it on public record that you're doing this. You are now committed publicly. There are witnesses that this book will come out telling this incredible. And I only tell a sliver of it in the book, because there's much more to tell, because it's a very long, arduous route to bring this guy to justice and to save the story. Anyway, I've got one more story to tell. This is the story I almost missed. It's inevitable. It happens in every book. Last spring, what is this? This is now March. Last spring in May, the book is still about 6 months, 4 months from publication. And the Warplane Heritage Museum guys asked me, and men and women, asked me to come to Hamilton and do this presentation. And I said, guys, I'd love to, but there are no books. I don't want to do a whole long presentation if I haven't got any books to present for people. They said, Ted, we want the 75th anniversary observed. You've got to do the talk. I said, okay. So there I am at the museum in full flight. And here's the Lancaster Vera. There were 700 people that day. Just to get a sense of what this anniversary was about. And so I didn't have any books to sell, so I laid out some pieces of paper, and we asked people if they were interested in paying ahead of time, and if they were interested to sign in a little square what they wanted inscribed in the book. And this woman in the line laid down her money and said, to my father, Flight Sergeant James McDowell. And I said, wait a minute, James McDowell was a dam buster. Who is this woman? She is his daughter. I didn't know she existed. There she is there. She gives me the flight log to see at the museum. There's her dad, Rear Gunner Jimmy McDowell. And I'm thinking, my gosh, this woman's got a story, and my book is finished. It's about to go to press. Literally, within days or weeks. So I asked Marilyn, would you allow me to come and interview you? So I went from my home in Uxbridge, in Ontario, to Burlington, about a 2-hour drive. I sat down with her, and here's the story she told me. She said, in 1941, her dad joins the Air Force. They're a family living in Geraldton, way up in northern Ontario. He's a gold miner. He leaves the mining job, joins the Air Force, sent off to Mossbank, to the gunnery training school there. Now the family's left without an income. So they moved from Geraldton to a one-room flat above a beauty salon in Port Arthur, which is half of now what's Thunder Bay, right? So they're living there. Mom makes enough money to help feed 2 daughters, including Marilyn. Now, Dad, Jimmy, who's been training in Saskatchewan, comes home for embarkation leave, right? Last stop home before he goes overseas. Comes home, plunks all of his gear in the middle of the one-room flat, his helmet, his goggles, his gloves, his boots, and his big, fat, flying winter suit, right? In the middle of the floor. Dad's home, Marilyn says. She's 6 and her younger sister. Big celebration. Dad's home, they have dinner, he's off to bed. In the darkness, in the night, Marilyn creeps out of her bed, comes into the center of the room where the pile of gear is sitting, crawls into her dad's flight suit, and sleeps in it. The last night Dad's home. Wait. Next morning, Marilyn and Dad Jimmy are at his bags, packing. He's leaving, about to take the train, to take the ship, to go to England. And on the radio, they're by themselves, Marilyn and Jimmy. On the radio comes Vera Lynn's White Cliffs of Dover. In the song, there's a line, and Jimmy will sleep in his own room again. And Jimmy McDowell turns to little Marilyn, 6 years old, and says very quietly but firmly, "No, he won't." He didn't think he'd come home. And he didn't. They flew in over the Zoider Z on the same mission, and were shot down, K for King. The entire aircraft swallowed up by the Zoider Z, and his body surfaces a month later. Now, as Marilyn is telling me this story, tears are streaming down my face, and hers. But worst of all, this story isn't in the book. It's about to go to press, and this story isn't there. So I give her a big hug, and thank you. I jump in the car, I'm driving home to Uxbridge, and I'm writing. And I'm thinking, wait a minute. The book is already laid out. It's been paginated, but at the end of every chapter, there's blank paper, right? Why don't I write something at the end of a fitting chapter that would just fit that slot? And I'm writing it in my head as I'm driving. And I get home, and I quickly bang out the story I just told you, and then I call the production editor at HarperCollins and wait for the paint to hit the fan. "Ted, the train has left the station. There's nothing more going in this book. Sorry, nothing." I said, Natalie was there. I said, "Natalie, this is gold. You've got to read it, and it'll go into the end of chapter 8, and that blank space that's there, 2 index references, we're set." She said, "Okay, I'll look at it." Send it in. An hour later, she's back to me. "You got to cut 100 words." Okay, I happen to live with one of the best editors in the world, my wife, Jane, who's been selling you the books. We chip away at the 350 words, we bring it down to 250 words. Send it back. Next morning, it's in. Yes! So now we go off to Nanton for the launch of the book in August, and we invite Dambuster families from all over Canada, not knowing how many are going to come. Anybody been to Nanton besides? Yeah. Great little museum. Maybe at Christmas time there might be 2,000 people in Nanton. On this night over the weekend we had 1,500 people come in and out of the museum. On that night there were nearly 60 Dambuster families representatives there, representing 16 different Dambuster families, including Marilyn. She came all the way from Berlin. These folks came all the way from Washington. Others from other parts of Canada are there in the museum. We closed off the museum simply to get the family full access to the museum. Anyway, we're all there having wine as the book is about to be launched, and I tell this story. With Marilyn sitting there, and I take one of the first books out of the box, and I give it to Marilyn, and I said, "Marilyn, your dad is in." There are very few satisfying aspects of writing greater than that. Knowing that the story you've slaved over, going back to my very first point about the need for veteran stories, to get these stories out, the face of our history. It's important on an anniversary year such as this past year was to remember Barnes Wallis, the Wellington dropping the spherical bomb, Guy Gibson for all his idiosyncrasies, and the extraordinary story that it was, but it's also vital that we mustn't forget. Thank you.
Well, I actually really love doing this. I've gone to Stonehenge, and I play in Lincoln Cathedral in England, and it's really my voice, because when I do tell my dad's story, that's his story. And growing up without him, I have my own story. And usually I'm better with music than I am with words, but I'm going to do it, Ted.
Or you can go sideways.
Oh, well, I'll figure it out. I'll look at the light. How's that? delicious.
Okay, John, okay. What's one?
Think it's warm air in here. Okay, I love this. This is my favorite song.
Thank you so much, and we have a traditional gift here. I know that, yes, it's back. Beautifully hand wrapped, I must say. A bottle of BC fermented grape juice.